This presentation by my colleagues Chengnan Gao, Alvin Huang, Professor Vincent Hui, and I, titled Zoom Off but Zoom In, will be discussing the integration of video game technologies into physically distanced classrooms. We will be covering how video games can be used as an architectural tool in the form of virtual field trips, projected ambition, and for building construction education, as well as presenting some student work that emerged from the pilot of using video games within architectural education. Video games have become a ubiquitous medium that goes well beyond recreation and saturates a wide range of daily life, including industry and education. That video games have rapidly expanded their versatility from recreational outlets for a range of casual and competitive gamers of all demographics through to advanced simulation and educational tools in a diversity of disciplines become apparent. Currently, 3D modeling, visualization, physics engines, and artificial intelligence infrastructures found in video game design are increasingly integrated into many other disciplines, most notably architectural praxis. That the dynamic forms found in contemporary architectural works have mushroomed with the greater frequency and less fanfare is primarily predicated on the accessibility of these digital design tools found in both video games and architecture, engineering, and construction industries. In this presentation, we will elaborate upon this relationship and how video games have directly and passively impacted current pedagogical practice and expectations. From historic recreations of the past to high-fidelity presentation of current architectural contexts, we will discuss the influences of video games on an architectural education and how the medium can be harnessed to mold the architects of the future.
As architectural pedagogy is heavily dependent on experience and understanding of precedent, video games can be seamlessly integrated into history, theory, and design courses. Real-world urban and architectural iconography can be found in video games, which offer gamers opportunities to travel into different cities virtually. The global pandemic happening currently causes difficulty to travel and visit culturally valued landmarks. The games such as Grand Theft Auto introduce the iconic building in their virtual environment, allowing the players to visit the tourist attraction. By designing the virtual context based off the real built environment in buildings, urban infrastructure, and landscape, the games allow the players to have a true traveling experience virtually. Despite the travel restriction policies have been applied in many nations today, virtual field trips designed in the video games provide in-person travel opportunities. Similar level of game modeling details can also be found in building interiors. Light simulation, materiality, and spatial quality all revert the real-world existing conditions. Yet the game established new activities and occupations, providing the players with a new perspective to perceive the familiar, remarkable architecture in an unfamiliar way. Despite the architecture created in the video games are replicated from up-to-date structures, the players have opportunities to walk around the built context under the past socio-cultural background. In many cases, buildings and the moments composed in video games are speculated from historic visualization. In Assassin's Creed Origins, the team reproduced the lost architecture, transferring imagery into a three-dimensional space. The digital models showcase a high level of research from construction to usage, which allows players to immersively experience how the Royal Library of Alexandria was occupied in ancient time. The video games also revivify the lost city context, including built forms and human activities, forming interesting contrasts of different traditions and occupations from the ancient Egypt into the same city. Those non-influential ancient urban houses were restored in the virtual environment, allowing the players to walk around a city that does not exist anymore. Architecture in video games could also be used as a study tool to examine how it changed over time in terms of construction and operation. The immersion into a historical period referred into architectural pedagogy within the history and theory curricula in order for students to understand architecture in its original context. Assassin's Creed set the kit to back the Victoria setting for London, demonstrating how the significant landmarks participated in the past and original context. Walking around the video games allows students to recognize how the architecture associated with the social and cultural life at the time. The appearance of Notre Dame can be seen within campaign missions, and the representation in the scale of the buildings and the surroundings is accurate to the Notre Dame that is seen today. The virtual context from the video games acknowledge the historical surroundings and the past history. Such portrayal of current history allows players to better understand the events and the developments made since then, as well as the state of disrepair and the miserable conditions in war-torn Europe. Political symbols hanging on the walls illustrate the architecture differently from the one present today. The video game showcases how an architecture could be represented differently under different socio-political contexts.
Video games are principally reliant on world building in order to convey their story arcs and action, thereby being inherently tied to architecture and urban design. Video games are not only amenable to representation of past and existing architectures, but can also be used to give life to architectural movements or styles, visualizing what architectural environments could be if they embody such aesthetic beliefs. BioShock is a first-person shooter game that takes place in Rapture, a city submerged under the sea. The game presents an alternative past where a city migrates underwater during the era of the Art Deco and skyscrapers as a utopian hideaway for American elites. Reminiscent of the architecture emerging from Chicago and New York in that era, Rapture combines mimicry of well-known buildings, including the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, with more imaginary architectural propositions such as the Hugh Ferris Majestic Hotel and Fitz Lang's Metropolis. The architecture presented in the game emphasizes ornamentation, with entrances and interiors featuring gold accent and sculptural elements typical of the time. Despite the architecture being inspired by built work, and some buildings heavily borrowing elements from existing architecture, BioShock presents an imaginary city, not only due to its subaquatic location, but also due to the consistency in its architectural style. Rapture's homogeneous architectural style is able to capture a city in standstill, one whose architectural ideologies and ideas halted over the course of its construction, thus providing a unique perspective for players while also representing the extremes of an architectural movement which would have been impossible to accomplish in built reality. Labias Woods, who was neither licensed nor a holder of an architectural degree, once said, "I'm not interested in living in a fantasy world. All of my work is meant to evoke real architectural spaces, but what interests me is what the world would look like if we were free of conventional limits. Maybe I can show what could happen if we lived by a different set of rules." Video game environments prove to be one such a world, which is not only unconstrained by building codes and physics, but also cost and functionality. Thus, video games prove to be a medium easily conducive to the immersive and navigable 3D representation of impossible or radical architectural propositions and ideas, such as those of Mr. Woods. Half-Life 2 presents infrastructural interventions within the city, drawing heavily inspiration from Wood's ideas and work. Although few of his designs were constructed in the real world, there are excellent precedents for designers building in the digital worlds. Similarly, Remedy Entertainment's Control becomes a platform of the realization of the brutalist dream, embodying many of the ideas from modernist and brutalist designers. The game's storyline occurs within a building titled The Oldest House in New York, inhabited by an organization that investigates human collective consciousness. Both the organization and the building itself embody the control of the state over the people, and so the Oldest House's architecture is entirely inspired by brutalist ideals. As evidenced here, the exterior facade of the building draws heavily inspiration from John Warnicki's AT&T Long Lines building in New York. Within the game, the building itself acts as an antagonist, a brutalist monster, which the player must navigate through to succeed in the game. The brutalist style was also selected due to its imposing cold and impersonal appearance and materiality, as well as its association with many government buildings and social projects. Brutalism is adored by many architects, as it is pure in architectural representation and allows designers to have full command over the goings on and occupation of spaces, which is reminiscent of the purposes of the building itself within the game. The interior spaces emphasize the large ceilings and out of scale elements that lead occupants to feel lesser, while light is used strategically as an architectural element in itself. In addition, the architecture within Control goes beyond the overall forms and aesthetics and begins to examine details as well, drawing inspiration from masters like Carlo Scarpa. Minute concrete details and assemblies are articulated.
Although many games provide an exterior reconstruction of the architectural facades of buildings, many games also undertake accurate building reconstruction, some reaching levels of accuracy, allowing students to be able to reference architecturally relevant topics such as structural loads, framing, building envelope assemblies, and mechanical systems. Call of Duty World War II takes place in war-torn Paris and Marigny in France, along with many more notable locations featuring gruesome battles that occurred during the World War. As an opportunity for virtual field trips to see the Notre Dame in Paris, the game also opens opportunities for examining building construction from structures within the past. Elements such as structure can be examined, looking at how game developers are taking in account of realistic methods of construction or a visual fantasy for sole entertainment purposes. As an educational exercise, noting impossible conditions as shown helps students verify their knowledge on concepts of structural forces and building construction. Moments of accurate representation is shown within the residential buildings in Marigny, featuring realistic timber framing construction that is revealed through damaged buildings that players are battling within, showcasing layering in roof and floor assemblies to placement of structural members and wall sections from blown apart buildings. A closer look at masonry wall assemblies within the residential buildings show accurate representations of separating firewalls, showcasing brick walls multiple wide thick and being layered precisely in placement of bricks in conjunction with mortar. Where Call of Duty World War II represents the state of European regions before the rebuilding efforts, Assassin's Creed Origins presents a reconstruction of lost architecture as it was before its destruction. The recent spate of games has exhibited an unprecedented amount of detail that showcases a high level of research into architectural practices from construction through to usage. In addition to the representation of the social and cultural life in ancient Egypt exhibited in Assassin's Creed Origins, a diverse collection of wall assemblies and building assemblies are shown as well. These range from expected mortar construction typical of the region, as well as the surprising and typically European wood, post, and beam techniques. From historic games to modern titles like Last of Us 2, modern representations of walls are shown from residential timber framing with board and batten techniques, to steel stud commercial walls, revealing placement of insulation, stud bracing, and plaster. Floor assemblies in the past from Assassin's Creed reveal heavy timber construction using large logs and masonry for structure and straw thatching for insulation and protection against winds and rain. Assassin's Creed also showcases structural elements clearly in historic Egypt, showing wood construction and having a clear hierarchy between primary and secondary elements. Taking a look back at Last of Us 2, they also showcase a lot about roof and floor assemblies. Damaged roof and floors show rebar, which would serve as tensile strength for reinforced concrete and structural wooden beams. The attention to detail in building envelope assemblies also is faithfully modeled after realistic construction details, with sensibility in components and their placement. Taking a closer look at steel construction, elements such as open web steel joists and steel decking are seen to be correctly layered beneath concrete flooring finishes. Assassin's Creed also showcases structural elements, showing the very thick stone walls and lighter wooden floor ceilings in construction type of older times. Video games can also showcase systems in buildings, from HVAC systems to fire prevention sprinklers, much of which is hard for students to understand without in-person experience. In Spider-Man, ducts are playable spaces where players are able to crawl in vents and to sneak across locations. In some cases, the ducts are shown correctly in terms of their construction and location in buildings. However, in reality, they are not as clean and traversable for people. This close-up look at HVAC systems is a great experience for students to see the systems that they're learning about and how to implement them within their building as well. The altering of reality in video games extends further in Mirror's Edge, which utilizes rooftops of buildings as a parkour map, putting a spin on how mechanical systems are laid out on buildings. It is an exaggeration of HVAC organization on rooftops, but showcases the need for back of house systems in buildings. In The Last of Us 2, there is also an integration of building systems within their gameplay, from abandoned elevator shafts to sprinkler systems, allowing players to experience these spaces without having to visit them in reality. After looking at the various ways and examples of video games showcasing building construction to design ambition, these elements as well as teaching experiences were absorbed by the students and translated into their work. The showcased animation features a student project taking into account of assemblies and structure within their studio design, noting things such as the facade assembly as well as structural beams and columns. In another student project, they were able to incorporate structure as well as systems within their project, showcasing the strong knowledge base of utility and function in their buildings. In terms of design ambition, there's an emphasis on materiality and the building's facade, playing with folds and reflectivity. This student project also has an emphasis on the facade in terms of building construction, showcasing structural members and fasteners for the facade panels, as well as design ambition in the expressional use, materiality, and its transparency in interaction with daylighting over time. Final project showcases the design ambition in the building's movable facade panels. The kinetic facade moves to play with lighting conditioning, providing shade at optimal times, and therefore combining ambition with knowledge of systems within the student's design. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for listening.